What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review episode 8 of season 4 of Better Call Saul, an episode called Coushatta. I'm going to try to keep this video brief tonight because I am not in my usual man cave. As you can see, I'm down in Virginia. I'm looking after my younger siblings, and I got to be up at the butt crack of dawn to make breakfast. So in that time with the factor, it's probably wise if I get right to the point. So for fans of both Better Call Saul as well as filmmaker Guillermo del Toro, there's a pretty cool bonding session earlier this week between co-creator Peter Gould and Guillermo del Toro on Twitter. And I absolutely love Guillermo del Toro. Love movies like Pan's Labyrinth. But he had something interesting to say about the show in his tweet. He said, "A small reflection in the middle of Better Call Saul's new season. I like it even more than Breaking Bad, not to be a contrarian, but because the evidence stakes seem smaller, but the moral downfall strikes me as deeper, more poignant. With Walter White, who turns black, you are tracking a massive downfall transformation. Better Call Saul takes you by the hand as Jimmy becomes Saul Goodman. No good in him, and small, painful tumbles. Kim is the key." And I feel like his tweet was eerily prophetic because in tonight's episode, Kim absolutely was the key. But before I get to my official recap and review, as always, I'd like to give a shout out to the podcast Better Call Saul Insider because they had a fascinating and incredibly technical conversation this past week about last week's episode. If you remember, the previous episode opened up with that beautiful split screen sequence. And while in the hands of master storytellers, it appears relatively simple, the amount of work and planning that went into that was kind of jaw-dropping, especially because the tight schedules in television don't usually afford the opportunities to indulge in that kind of visual experimentation. And they basically found a way to cheat it. They never carved out specific days in the schedule to shoot that sequence, but they planned ahead. And whenever they were going to be on those locations anyway for other scenes, they managed to grab a few shots for that opening sequence. In any event, if you want to do the deep dive into the nuts and bolts of the technical side of achieving those split screen shots, I definitely recommend last week's episode of Better Call Saul Insider. But let's dive into tonight's episode, which featured yet another great pre-credit sequence, although it wasn't quite as technically imaginative as last week's episode. But at least it didn't leave us hanging on what this master plan was that Kim had at the end of last week's episode. Because as we see, Jimmy gets on a bus headed towards Coushatta, Louisiana, and he's got a stack of stationery and markers and pens, and along the way he basically recruits the people that he meets to write letters on Huell's behalf. And obviously because of all the different people he's encountering, there'll be a variety of writing styles, there'll be a wide range of different ways that people express themselves, and the sequence ends when he arrives in Coushatta. And initially I was a little bewildered until the scene later on in the episode when the judge presiding over Huell's case just gets an office full of mail from Coushatta, Huell's hometown. But for sure this is becoming increasingly grim and gritty and more of like a criminal underworld show. It's always fun to see Jimmy and Kim running one of these cons or one of these scams where there's no real violence involved, just a little bit of deception and sleight of hand. Because as we see in the first major scene of the episode, Nacho is back in action. We see that he's climbing up the ranks in terms of where he sits in the restaurant when drug dealers come in to deliver that week's take. And we get a ruthless, savage scene where one of his dealers is a little light that week. Nacho very calmly asks him to come over and just reaches up and just yanks a bunch of jewelry right out of the flesh of his ear. And he seems to do it without his heart rate even rising one iota. But he doesn't seem to take any pleasure in it. I feel like this show definitely has a lot of criminals who are total savages who would delight in causing pain. And Nacho almost seems like he's resigned to this new role that he has to perform on Gus's behalf. And we get a very sweet, poignant scene where he goes home. I mean, his house is incredible. He's got these two beautiful girls hanging out there. They're partying and doing drugs. And he has kind of a sad, reflective moment as he's looking at the IDs of both him and his father before he locks them away in a safe. It makes me feel like he's probably planning some sort of escape plan where he and his father can head elsewhere. But one of the major set pieces of this episode is when Mike finally takes Werner and his boys out for a little R&R. They hit the strip club. And watching Mike stand off to the side, kind of presiding over the proceedings, was absolutely hysterical. Because while he doesn't disapprove, he's not necessarily indulging either. And we see that Kai and the rest of the boys are absolutely raising hell. But eventually Mike and Werner have had enough of the noise and the cacophony, and they go next door to a quiet bar where they can just hang out and shoot the shit. And this is when the episode slips into kind of dangerous territory, but it went in a completely different direction than I anticipated. Because Werner overhears somebody ordering a Hefeweizen beer. Werner corrects his pronunciation. And initially what I thought was going to happen, I thought this guy was going to be somebody who is intolerant of outsiders or intolerant of foreigners, or was going to say something really stupid about the fact that Werner's from Germany. In any event, I thought it was going to lead to some sort of trouble that would call attention to Werner. But the situation gets more complicated because Mike gets called back over to the strip club where, of course, Kai's gotten into trouble. When it comes to the rules of looking and touching and what you pay accordingly, Kai has, of course, managed to fuck it all up. Made a total spectacle of himself. And Mike, badass motherfucker that he is, very calmly steps in, says that the cops don't need to be called, the Kai's gonna go home, Mike's gonna make things right. And I feel like we have so much to learn from Mike, just that even-toned way of speaking. He asks if the girl's all right. He makes sure that she gets a little extra cash. And we get a great beat where Kai tries to push back initially against Mike, and Mike just looks at him with this dead expression. Is like, try me. I don't know, I can't remember if that was the exact line, but it's something to that effect. But when it comes to exuding a menace of absolute death and destruction with a few simple words, Jonathan Banks is the absolute master. But as it turns out, this momentary distraction has gotten Werner into some hot water. He just doesn't know it yet. In a very good-natured way, he's hanging out with two guys who are asking about engineering and architecture, and they're tossing back beers, and they're having a blast. And you can tell he's just enjoying sharing his expertise and his knowledge with these two young engineers. So obviously when it comes to those characters, the episode took a completely different direction. But as it turns out, Werner's had one too many. He's divulging way too much information. And Mike very wisely steps in and tells him that his wife needs to talk to him on the phone. Werner finally, after a couple of beats, gets the message and reluctantly gets up and leaves. And the following day, Mike gives him a very candid, clear, come to Jesus moment where he just tells him the person we're working for, the person who's paying you all this money, is a very serious person. And while he doesn't say anything in terms of a threat of violence or any sort of major consequences, once again, Jonathan Banks, he can communicate volumes with just an expression and the smallest gesture, and Werner absolutely gets the message. Which is cool because much later in the episode, Mike is able to give Gus basically a status report about how they are way behind schedule. However, the work is very solid, it's very good. He brings him up to speed on the accidents. He brings him up to speed on the planned elevator shaft. Now they're going to have to blast a bunch of rock. And while Gus is definitely pouring piles of money into this project, he genuinely seems pleased with the progress under Mike's supervision. But the thing that was an absolute delight to watch this episode was watching Kim's full court press to look after Huell's needs. We see that she's brought in a ton of associates. We see that she's going to be racking up tons of billable hours. She's filing a continuance. She wants to study the surveillance camera footage in the area. She wants to study the cop's history. And the prosecuting attorney thinks she's being absolutely ridiculous, diverting so many resources to something that should be a pro bono case. And it doesn't look like she's going to give an inch until they're summoned to the judge's office. They basically see enough fan mail there as if Huell's a member of the Beatles in the early 60s. Immediately suspicious something is up, the prosecuting attorney decides to dig a little deeper. And this is when we see the old Jimmy McGill at his best, where he's got his team of filmmakers. They've got a call center set up. They've got a crowdfunding campaign set up on his behalf, and basically every single phone number that was included on any of the letters, they've got an actor there doing impersonations. And the best is getting to see Bob Odenkirk do a southern accent as if he's a preacher in a small church in Louisiana. And I imagine anybody who's from the bayou in Louisiana would not be fooled for a second by his accent. But when it comes to talking to a lawyer from Albuquerque, New Mexico, she's 100% fooled. And Bob Odenkirk, in spite of the fact that the show is getting grimmer and darker, he remains an absolute comic genius. And I really enjoyed seeing him cut loose on that particular scene. But the relationship between Jimmy and Kim was a bit of an emotional roller coaster for me this episode, because earlier in the episode, we see Jimmy going back to his old place at the salon. He's getting some love life advice from his old landlord, and she's explaining the best way for him to say he's sorry. And he says very frankly that he thinks they might be past the point of saying sorry. And I was like, wow, this is getting really sad and really demoralizing, watching them really go their separate way. But then we get this fantastic twist late in the game in the episode. Kim shows up, and then she lays the world's biggest, sexiest kiss on him. And it was just an absolute magical moment. It's like a moment from the golden age of Hollywood. And then we get some fantastic pillow talk. They're lying in bed, and Jimmy's still doing the Southern preacher routine. He's talking about, oh, I got crawdads in my underpants from sitting in the bayou. And he's just, I mean, Bob Odenkirk, goddamn, he makes me laugh. And better still, it leads to a twist that I absolutely did not see coming. And this show, if anything, has always been wildly unpredictable. When it comes to writing, directing, everything is always first rate. But I don't know if any of the audience members have ever been able to successfully predict or anticipate the direction this show might be headed. Because later in the day, Jimmy's looking for a new office, and he finds this rodent-infested place with like leaky holes. And we get this great shot from the point of view of the hole with water dripping. And Kim spots his car and decides to swing by for a talk. And it's a really cool, lengthy, enigmatic scene. She's sitting there, she's smoking cigarettes. She's just looking so hot and so confident, but you can tell she's really thinking about something. And Jimmy immediately assumes the worst, assumes she's pissed at him, that he basically took advantage of her trust, and that he dragged her into something that she shouldn't have been involved in. And then we get the best curveball of the episode. She turns to him and just says, "Let's do it again." I mean, it's such a simple line, but it was so hot and so sexy and so dramatically thrilling. It was one of the best ways to bring an episode to a close. Granted, I don't know if it's the best idea for Kim's long-term prospects in her career as a lawyer to be getting involved in more cons and scams with Jimmy, but I've been operating under the assumption for the last couple episodes that Jimmy and Kim, they were having their inevitable parting in the ways, but it looks like they might have one or two last big hoorahs together, working as a team. And we get one final scene where we see that Nacho is having to deal with a new person at the restaurant who's basically there to keep an eye on him. He claims he's good with numbers and that Nacho will never notice him, but we can tell that Nacho increasingly resents this new role that he's playing. In any event, the teaser gave away very little. There's a throwaway line about the fact that Jimmy's becoming a lawyer again in a week, but otherwise there's just a few flashes and impressions, so we have no idea what's to come, apart from the fact there are only 2 episodes left this season. But as great as the season has been overall, I feel like this episode really gave us an incredible sense of momentum pushing us toward the inevitable climax of the season. So I was absolutely delighted. I guess the only thing missing from tonight's episode were some great conversations about movies or some visual cues or nods to classic movies, or if there were some nods to classic movies, I overlooked them. But I always love seeing what Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould come up with when it comes to referring to their favorite flicks. But if anybody picked up on any details that I overlooked, definitely let me know in the comments below, or you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But if you enjoyed this reaction and review, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Heading back to New York day after tomorrow, so my subsequent videos will be back in my normal man cave. But thanks as always for the support for this channel. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, onwards and upwards.